Now is Strike CEO Jack Mallers, the company announcing its expansion into Argentina today. Jack, it's great to have you back. This is a big deal, but do you think the government will be as receptive as El Salvador's was?
Yo, Kelly, Happy New Year. Let's change the world. No, I don't. Listen, Kelly, I'm not a government consultant. I'm here to change the world, push our species in a direction that I think will make the world a better place. And the El Salvadoran government aligned with the vision and thought Bitcoin was a useful tool for their citizens. The Argentine government, that's not my job. I'm just impressed with my team, impressed with Bitcoin and the tool set that we've been allowed for with what Satoshi created and making the world a better place. We're giving the people of Argentina a monetary asset, a monetary policy, a monetary network that they can rely on and make free instant cross-border payments that subscribe to an asset and a store of wealth that is external of any government or central party intervention that's really pained them over the last 100 years.
Well, and Argentina obviously has had such a tough time with inflation. I know when I visited there about a decade ago, they basically said just use your U.S. dollars because, you know, that's a better way to do business around here. Don't even bother changing it into pesos and back. So I see the use case. In El Salvador's case, it's not like you partnered with the government to go in there. You launched the app. It got really successful. And then they wanted to look into that. So I'm just going to be curious to see if you're successful in Argentina, if you're met with sort of similar should we say, tacit approval by the authorities there, or if they would have any reason to say, you know what, we don't want our citizens doing business this way.
Yeah, so Kelly here, this is what I think is interesting is that you're exactly right. The inflation that has plagued Argentina, their unit of account is US dollars and demand for dollars is through the roof. In the parallel black market, a dollar is worth twice as much as it is according to the official rate. So they are looking to store their wealth in something else. Many of them use Bitcoin, but even that is too volatile for them. However, their ability to make payments, Kelly, this is a cash economy. People buy houses with cash. They're not even allowed to use payment networks that are denominated in dollars. The Visa network that operates on US dollars does not work in Argentina. It is banned. And so for Strike, what's really interesting for us is offering them a convenient cash collateral. They like their daily spending cash collateral to be in dollars, but interfacing that cash collateral over the Bitcoin and Lightning network, making it seamless to make instant free cross-border payments. And so to the individual, if you want to hold as much Bitcoin or as little Bitcoin as you want, that is up to you. What we allow you to do is hold a dollar-like cash collateral, but then use the Bitcoin network under the hood to escrow the value to make for digital seamless payments and excuse them of this really monstrous cash-based economy.
They're telling me I have about 2 minutes, Jack, and I have about 10 minutes worth of questions. So let me just try to get through this quickly. Is Venezuela next for you?
Everywhere is next for us. The novel thing about Bitcoin is it takes the property that makes internet companies valuable and important is that they have a target audience of all 8 billion people. It is an open, global, singular network. The good thing about Strike is that we get to sell them money, not advertising. We're delivering one of the most viral products in human history, and that's money. It's akin to like water to live a high quality of life. And so the combination of that, we get to try and sell money to all 8 billion people, a better financial and superior financial experience. So I'm on a mission to deliver this to everyone that has a pulse on this planet.
Happy Bitcoin Tuesday, freaks. It's your boy Matt Odell here for Citadel Dispatch 52. Citadel Dispatch is an interactive live show about Bitcoin distributed systems, privacy, and open source software. As I went over last week, Dispatch is no longer available on the TFTC podcast feed. So if you enjoy podcasts, go search Citadel Dispatch in your favorite podcast feed and subscribe there instead. Also, we have moved our live chat over to Matrix, a distributed open source protocol that allows messaging to be done in an encrypted way from self-hosted servers around the world that are federated. That might sound complicated, but it's a lot easier to use than you might expect. If you go to citadel.chat, you can join that live chat. That is not exclusive to Bitcoin Tuesdays. We have over 500 Bitcoiners in there now that are just constantly talking about very important topics that affect all Bitcoiners and different tips and tricks. It's a very cool little community we're building over there. So come join us. My favorite Matrix client, there's a bunch of different Matrix clients you can use to chat in the room. My favorite one is Element. You can go to element.io to download it on your computer or your phone. Huge shout out to the freaks that are joining us in the live chat. We do appreciate you. You guys make this show unique. And a really big shout out to all of our supporters that keep Dispatch 100% audience funded without ads or sponsors and purely focused on actionable Bitcoin discussion. If you want to support the show, it is all being done through Bitcoin. So there are two ways you can do it. You can do it through Podcasting 2.0 apps. My favorite are Fountain Podcasts and Breeze Wallet. They operate as traditional podcasting apps where you load sats up, though. You put some sats on it, you search Citadel Dispatch, and then as you're listening, you can stream sats directly to my node. The other way is through BTC Pay Server, which you can access at citadeldispatch.com. You can send funds on-chain or Lightning that way. I also have a Paynim with support for Samurai or Sparrow Wallet. My Paynim is Odell. It's very easy to remember. So to all the freaks out there that continue to support the show, I really do appreciate you. I really do not want to add ads or sponsors. I think that keeping this completely 100% audience funded is quite an undertaking, but it is rewarding long-term. And I really do appreciate all of you that continuously support the show. So thank you. With all that said, we have a very fun, interesting topic today that I'm really looking forward to with some great guests. This is Citadel Dispatch 52. The focus is Venezuela, Latin America, and Bitcoin. Our first guest is Sultan Bitcoin. How's it going, Sultan?
Yo, how you all doing? Stoked for having me here.
Cheers. Thank you for joining us. And our second guest is Mauricio. How's it going, Mauricio? Did we lose him? We cannot hear you.
Sorry. I'm back. Unfortunately, I had accidentally pressed the mute button. Sorry, guys. Very happy to be here and always happy to chat Venezuela and Bitcoin.
Awesome. So, I mean, I don't have... Sultan reached out to me, asked if I was interested in this topic. I am very interested in this topic. I very much feel like Latin America, this has been the year of Latin America entering the Bitcoin scene in a big way. And I think a lot of people are underestimating what the significance of that can be. But overall, I mean, you guys are both Venezuelans. I am not. This is not necessarily my area of expertise. So I'm going to be leaning on you guys to kind of lead this discussion. So with all that said, I mean, where do you want to start? Where do you think is the best place to start here?
There's so many places that we could take this, but I think maybe to set the stage for I guess broadly what the situation that a lot of Latin America finds itself in. Maybe we could speak about the sort of history of Latin America that has had with inflation. And I can speak to I know Venezuela's kind of history with inflation quite well. I'm not, I know of the other inflationary problems that the other countries have had, but I wouldn't consider myself an expert. But I'd be happy to kind of set the stage for what kind of led to hyperinflation in Venezuela and kind of how that kind of not corner but ushered people into Bitcoin out of necessity. I don't know if you agree with that, Ale.
No, completely, man. Just let's take it from there.
Sure. So maybe to start, I guess Venezuela, it's maybe I'll try to kind of start from the beginning. But Venezuela has always been a very resource-rich country, and very like known by most people because we were great producers of oil. We had massive oil production capacity. We still have the largest oil reserves in the planet, but still, it is one of the most impoverished countries in the world. So a lot of people wonder how that happened. How do we go from still the country with the most sort of potential resources in terms of energy, how is everybody starving and people not have enough money to eat? And the answer is complicated. It's not really a simple answer. But I think one of the things that stood out to me as I was growing up, and this is a problem not just for Venezuela, but for many economies that are resource rich, is that once you have a way of fabricating money, whether it's by sort of yanking it out of the ground, or printing it, like Venezuela was able to get away with murder for a lot of years because they didn't really have to manage a tight book in terms of like the money they spent and the money they collected in taxes, because they always had this massive kind of oil subsidy that they could just yank out of the ground. But they got really the problem with oil is that also because the country relies on oil so much and the economy relies on oil so much, whenever oil prices rally or crash, that led into political turmoil as well, because every time oil prices dropped, the economy suffered, and we got into this, everybody started pointing fingers, and that makes it very difficult to run the country. But I think what really tripped things over the edge in Venezuela was obviously the political event that occurred, which was when the sort of Communist Party took over, at first democratically, but slowly over time it started dismantling the democratic institutions, which turned into sort of a full-out dictatorship, and that's what kind of led to the first round of people trying to look for the door and causing that first bout of hyperinflation. But I'll pause.
No, yeah, I guess it's just a very interesting way to start the conversation here, and related to what Mauricio was saying, like, it's mostly related to what economists now call the natural resource curse, right? So there's this famous words from a Venezuelan in 1976. His name was Juan Pablo Perez Alfonso. Basically, this was the Venezuelan diplomat that in the 70s, going all the way into the 80s, he was the pioneer at structuring the OPEC, the OPEC cartel, right, and the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries. And in 1976, he said that 20 years from now, Venezuelans would start seeing that oil would bring us ruins, right? And he called it the devil's excrement. So I guess it's funny because every single time as Venezuela has started approaching, nowadays, what we basically experienced as Venezuelans was just the government trying to find other ways of financing itself. And that's how gradually the government started, breaking down the rule of law that was created during the 30s, the 40s, and 50s and 60s, that basically created what was at its time the most stable banking system of all of Latin America, right? So eventually, to Mauricio's point, right? Whenever that started happening, you saw how the tissues of the system started tearing apart. And so the democratization of Venezuela started becoming the socialization, right? And so Venezuela diving into socialism and eventually dictatorship. To the point today, right? You need after government started financing itself using the Venezuelan banking system and using the savings of people in 1983. Venezuela experienced what we call our own Black Friday event. So essentially, after a huge shortage of cash, again related to the volatility of oil prices and and the international oil market. This Luis Campins, the Venezuelan president in the 80s, he basically devalued by over 50% overnight all of the Venezuelan savings by essentially forcing, right, and putting in place country currency exchange rates in the country. So since the 80s, we started truly seeing our currency, the Venezuelan bolivar, depreciating against the dollar because of this shortage of cash and that was basically the initial stages of just, to quickly summarize it, bad monetary policies and administrative policies coming from different Venezuelan regimes since then.
So this is interesting. I never really thought about it from the resource rich angle. So like the way you guys are describing it here, would you say it's like kind of similar to like what we see happen to like lottery winners or professional athletes that just they like get a lot of money and they just don't know how to spend it, so they just end up broke at the end of the day?
Or ICO companies, I would add as
Right.
well. So it's a similar kind of culture, or because it creates this sense of there is no need to be accountable, right? Like there's always more where that came from, kind of thing, and it just doesn't. You don't have an incentive to run a tight ship, and so that sets kind of a bad culture to start with. But I think one thing that one of the lessons that I've learned over the years is that people tend to think of inflation and hyperinflation as like an extension of the same thing. And I actually think they're both caused by very, very different reasons. So what I mean by that is inflation is typically an economic phenomenon, meaning what's happening in the US right now is that the government printed 40% of extra dollars and prices of things have rocketed by more than 40%. And that's inflation. That is very much related to the extra money that was printed, right? And so what you see in the prices is simply a reflection of the new size of the money supply, right? That's just your basic inflation. That's just a rational reaction to an increase in money supply. Hyperinflation is actually a complete loss of faith in the system, right? It's not necessarily you reacting to an extra 10 or 20% of money that got printed by pricing your assets by an additional 30 to 40%, right? Or 20%. That's just proportional. Hyperinflation happens when you've lost complete faith in that the value of the currency that you're using is going to hold any of its value. So you basically proactively start getting rid of any exposure you have to that currency actively, like in a matter of time. And the other thing, just to put it in Bitcoiner terms, the higher the inflation, the higher your time preference. You cannot have low time preference, or it's incredibly difficult to have a low time preference in a high inflation environment, because you're trained to spend it as soon as you get it. And you're trained to think in increasingly shorter and shorter time frames, because there is no ability to project anything 5-6 months out, because inflation makes that impossible. And so it just throws society into this shorter and shorter cycles of things and more uncertainty. And it gets you to the point where you lose faith in holding the currency, you lose faith in investing in that market locally, you lose faith in your property assurances in that market. So it's basically hyperinflation really hits when a large majority of the economic participants in that country see that state or that political project as a failed project. And so while I think countries like Venezuela, Turkey, Sudan, others that are sort of their entire democratic institutions are just completely out of whack, that's when you see hyperinflation. I find it personally very difficult to think that we're going to have anything close to hyperinflation in a place like Canada or the US anytime soon. And that's because it's really only because the fiat system is just a set of dominoes, and the base domino is the US. So before the US goes into hyperinflation, we're going to have to see hyperinflation in a world of other currencies, like the Bolivar, like the peso, because these currencies are going to get sold off much before the dollar does.
Well, like what happens, right, is so like if Venezuela has experienced hyperinflation or Argentina has experienced hyperinflation, people tend to escape to other fiat currencies first, right? So they look for the stronger ones, and typically that'll be the US dollar, to a lesser extent maybe the Canadian dollar, right?
Completely only the US dollar. So like euros only really will enter the picture if there is a full out sanction of dollars, like what happened in Venezuela. But broadly speaking, when currencies fail, the participants inside that society rush to the dollar. It's what they know, it's what they pay their invoices in, it's what they do all international trade with. And so an economy like, for example, Venezuela today is a fully dollarized economy. The only people that use bolívares in Venezuela are the people that absolutely have to, because they have no choice or they do not know any better. So, and this has been the case in many places in Latin America. So, for example, Panama is a dollarized society, 1-to-1 peg. Ecuador, dollarized society, 1-to-1 peg. In Peru, you can legally use the dollar, 1-to-1 peg. El Salvador is a great example of a country that lost its seigniorage and used 1-to-1 dollar. So there is already so many precedents of Latin American currencies that have failed, and then the dollar has been adopted by proxy. And that is just, in my view, that is sort of a sort of currency subordination in a sort of a global scale, because that particular country was unable to maintain demand for their own local currency. That they couldn't instill enough trust in their own country to hold their own currency.
Right. I mean, that makes sense to me. But then you also see there's another dynamic at play, right? Where these governments, when their back is up against the wall and they see people leaving their currency, they tend to try and close the exits, right? Like in Argentina right now, it's very hard to use dollars in the traditional financial system. Like there's massive usage of, my understanding is there's massive usage of dollars in form of cash. But in terms of actually trying to move it through banks and whatnot, that is being blocked actively by the government. Are you seeing that same thing in Venezuela, or are they just allowing people to use dollars in traditional financial ways? And like, how does Bitcoin enter that equation, right? Because I feel like it's harder to block the Bitcoin exits than it is to block the USD ones.
Right. So I think that I could expand on that one. And it's pretty much related in a huge way to what Mauricio was saying about, the system at some point completely fallen down the cliff after coming from rampant inflation to high inflation, all the way down to hyperinflation once you fall down the cliff. So let me give you the boots on the ground experience of 2017, pre like a couple of months before hyperinflation started to kick in the Venezuela economy. So it is amazing how at some point after, you're not able any longer to, close some contracts or agreements with anyone, because after a month or potentially weeks, the currency that's part of the underlying currency that's part of that agreement lost 20 to 30% of its value, right? So, which makes the jurisdictional system, in this case, the Venezuelan jurisdictional system, which had completely banned, right, the usage of other fiat currencies, people lose trust in it because it stops functioning. It doesn't function efficiently, and people just can't rely any longer on that jurisdictional system. So basically, what started happening is, after the government started financing itself by, fixing forex rates and the forex market in Venezuela, that started trickling down to the banking system and the banks that were basically assigned with the power to assign dollars to businesses and tourists. So essentially, Venezuelans traveling abroad the country with this preferential exchange rate for the US dollar to Bolivar rate, right? So it started at a governmental level. It grinds down to a banking system level, public banks, private banks. Then it trickles down to businesses. And then at some point, the people on the ground, right, on the streets, they start noticing. The people that live in the informal economy, right, that didn't own a bank account or whatever, they start noticing, and they say, okay, I can no longer rely on this form of cash. What else can I do? And so in 2017, you started seeing this very interesting trend in Venezuela, whereby informal merchants, right, and informal businesses were basically forced, because of the velocity of money and inflation and how rapid it starts increasing. They were forced to open up bank accounts so that they were essentially able to open up more ways for receiving and commercializing their merch, because essentially it was almost impossible, to just like receive cash in the morning and then by the afternoon or next day go to the supermarket, and you had already lost the value of your savings would have already depreciated so much that you were not able. You were no longer able to buy the same amount of goods, right? So it's just a matter of speed. To Mauricio's point, speed in the economy starts increasing, and you just try to become this person that is that you're essentially trying to look for more ways to intake money and then get rid of it faster. So in 2017, I remember when at some point you were still able to transact and live in bolivares in the country. If you had dollars and you exchange your dollars or Bitcoin, right, to your point, Matt, you were essentially financing a lifestyle for a couple of hundreds of dollars a month, which you couldn't finance yourself with thousands or tens of thousands of dollars abroad, right? So outside of Venezuela. So when that started happening and people on the ground started noticing, you saw, I remember telling my girlfriend that I was so worried because $1 was already worth 30 bolivares in the country, and then after a couple of months, it was already worth 100 bolivares, 200 bolivares, 300 bolivares, and then hyperinflation started coming in. Then the problem here is when hyperinflation started coming in, and the Venezuelan government had banned the usage of dollars, whatever, euros, whatever. People started essentially reverting to their family members that had already left the country, and they would try to send them money back into the country via this, informal money transmitters that would essentially assist these people and businesses mainly that wanted to get rid of the currency and receive essentially dollars in a U.S. bank account abroad, or people that would travel into the country, family members that were coming to the country to visit their family would essentially bring cash, piles of cash, as much as they could, just to bring it to their families. Then the thing is that in 2017, the other important thing to mention that happened is that the U.S. sanctioned the Venezuelan regime. So the Venezuelan government started plugging, right? As they try to come up with ways to continue moving the economy and treat this hyperinflation anomaly, which was, in part also because of not being able to access dollars within the international, the global banking system, nor the euro because they were banned by the EU as well. They were forced to hit the money printer harder, right? And so what they started doing after that was essentially plug cash into the Venezuelan economy to the point in which right now 90% of all transactions done to merchants in Venezuela it's dollars, dude. Honestly, like if you go to a favela or like a small town in Venezuela right now and you want to buy a glass of juice from a teenager that is selling juice on the streets just to make a living, she or he doesn't want bolivars anymore. It's all being priced in dollars. It's so, as the
And that's
unit of
all.
an,
That's
go
mostly
ahead.
cash based, or are they
Exactly,
using?
exactly. That's mostly cash based, and then you also have, certain people uh, do commerce over, like PayPal accounts, or Zelle, or Zelle payments. So like payments within the U.S. banking system. So it's at a local level that the exchange is happening, but it's at an international level that the transfer of value is happening. So it's essentially not happening within the Venezuelan banking system any longer. Now, if you look at the reports of certain firms that they have like their own statistical analysis and models, and they're backed by the IMF to come up with like real data for the Venezuelan economy. 1.9% of all payments being done made to merchants in Venezuela right now is being done with cryptocurrencies. If you look at the IMF standards, based on their standards, anything above the 1% threshold is considered as relevant. So it is huge. It is at a huge level, very relevant, the amount of payments that are being done with cryptocurrencies within the Venezuelan economy. And that just, and if we take two steps back between 2017 and today, what we saw happening, Mauricio and I started seeing this when I went to college. My friends started doing this. I started doing this. Essentially, we just found a better way to beat like a faster, more efficient way to beat the old informal money transmitters that were just receiving bolivars and making payments within U.S. bank accounts or Panamanian accounts or whatever outside of the country. We just found local Bitcoins, Sur Bitcoin. Now we have Binance Speed Up here. Paxful used to work in the country at the time, but we were just able to beat them at their own game by using Bitcoin as the underlying currency to essentially exchange bolivars for dollars outside of Venezuela. And that will bring us to the point where Mauricio will start explaining us his whole story of how his brother started mining Bitcoin in Venezuela. And then when Mauricio traveled back to Venezuela from Canada, he was mind blown by his brother showing him how in under an hour, he was able to get him bolivars into his bank account from his computer without resorting back to, any this what we call informal money transmitters.
Yeah, that's a good point, Alessandro. And I think I wanted to extend a little bit on what Matt said earlier, which was governments make it hard for you to protect your savings once inflation starts hitting. And I just wanted to give maybe like a quick like a story, or not a story, but essentially kind of paint a picture as I see it, and as in my view what kind of went down in Venezuela. So typically what happens is most governments look at their local currency exchange rate against the US dollar as essentially a barometer of how well the investment community or their own citizens perceive their country. And what I mean by that is, if your government is doing a great job and people want to invest in your project and they think you're going in a right direction, you don't really have an incentive to sell your local cash into dollars. If anything, you have an incentive to bring your dollars from overseas and invest them in the country. And when you do that, you're effectively buying local currency with dollars. And what that does is that elevates the price of your local currency relative to dollars. So if your government plan is great and your constituents are all aligned, what you should see is a stable currency that in fact could even become stronger or remain at a level of ground relative to the dollar. Okay. If you come out with a wild plan like what happened in Venezuela, where Chavez's plan was literally to give free things to everybody for free, everything for free for everybody, the investment community, understanding that money doesn't grow on trees, was absolutely freaked out, and they said, I will not be caught dead financing, giving everyone free everything with my money, because that's the only way they're going to get the assets to give people free things, is they're going to print more and they're going to debase my savings. So I'm going to take my savings away from this currency, and I will not be exposed to that ridiculous plan of government that will surely fail. Okay. What the government does is they say, no, Mr. Investor, you are wrong. Our plan to give free things to everybody will work, and you just haven't seen this done right. And what they say, and eventually they come at odds, right? And investors continue to sell off their local currency to buy dollars to get their money out. And what this does is that this starts ramping up the rate of exchange, and the government starts looking really poorly, because now an average person needs more of the local currency to buy the same good. So the government wants to prevent, they do not want to look bad. So instead of fixing the problem at the core, what they do is they try to fix the price of certain things. And they at first they try to fix the price of a particular asset or a good, and later they go in to fix the price of the exchange rate of the actual dollar. So what I wanted to say is, just to your point, Matt, they will, as they see that people do not agree with the government plan and they start selling off their local currency for dollars, things that they do believe in, the government starts saying, you cannot do that. That is not allowed. They don't say, we're doing something wrong, let's fix it so you don't want to take your money out. They say you are not allowed to take your money out. And what that has created over the years in many Latin American societies is this idea that because our governments have been so volatile over time, most wealthy people in Latin America, once they make a little bit of wealth, the first thing they do is they send it out of their local banking system, out of their local currency. And so Bitcoin is not really that different in the sense that it is just one more exit door. And to your point, when things go tough, they will try to ban Bitcoin, and they will try to ban Bitcoin because it's working. And that is exactly what I think is happening in Russia right now, in Turkey, in China, and any other place that wants to ban Bitcoin. And what that tells me is that it's actually doing precisely what it's designed to do for its citizens. Hey guys, no, sorry if I lost you. Sorry.
Hey, no, we're here. I don't know if Matt's still here though.
No, that's fine. To me, it's really just the government tried to never. They just want to keep their optics at all costs, and it's all a big theater, which is unfortunate. But yeah, they can't really do much. Once people discover Bitcoin, and once people realize that they do not want to hold that asset, they will do whatever it takes to get rid of it.
I think Mac is back, and as Matt gets back, I love reading here. We're at blog 720,000 whatever, and then it says 2,710 sats per dollar. But one sat is already worth more than one bolivar right now, right? like if you take into account the 14 zeros that the Venezuelan government took off the bolivar, right now you need approximately like 480 trillion bolivars just to buy a dollar in the country. So fiat is an illusion of the power. Go ahead, Matt. I think we lost you.
Yeah, I'm back. Sorry about that. I had a little bit of an internet issue here. Seems to be resolved. I was afraid it was going to kill the whole stream, so I'm glad that we are still live, it appears. So where are we in this conversation? Don't let me hold you guys back. I know one of the big things that I wanted to touch on, just to go back a tiny bit, is there was some conversation there about Venezuelans using the traditional financial system to move dollars around, whether that's Zelle or some other kind of finance app. Venezuela has a little bit of a unique twist on other Latin American hyperinflation stories in that it's also a sanctioned country. How do like how does like the whole like how are people able to use apps like Zelle if the country's under sanctions?
So this is a very interesting nuance about Venezuela that many people don't know, and I think this nuance illustrates a couple of things quite well. It illustrates how well the Venezuelan government is able to spin propaganda to make people believe things that aren't actually true. Um, and the other piece that I think this illuminates is how strategic. The flip side of that is how strategic the U.S. government can be on certain things. So let me kind of explain. Venezuela is not a sanctioned country. Venezuela, there are several Venezuelan entities that are sanctioned. So the country
Ah,
itself is not sanctioned. The people who are sanctioned are rogue government officials and the state oil company. And interestingly, the United States over the last 3 years continues to be the biggest buyer of Venezuelan oil. And so the sanction narrative is really a fabrication of the Venezuelan regime to essentially paint the U.S. as a boogeyman that prevents their people from thriving, but is actually very, very misunderstood in the sense that the United States does not fully sanction the country. McDonald's is still there, Coca-Cola is still there, Procter and Gamble, Oreo is still there. It's really a facade.
gotcha. So what's the deal with the oil purchases? Like, can we unpack that? I don't even know if it's that relevant to this conversation, but I'm curious.
So I'll caveat this with I'm not necessarily like an oil expert. What I will say is that Venezuela is a unique oil producer um, for a few reasons. One, so before this whole mess with Chavez started, there's actually a pretty tight link between the U.S. and Venezuela, and it's broadly because of a company called Citgo. Citgo, and you probably have seen the Citgo gas stations throughout the U.S. Citgo is actually a Venezuelan company, and Citgo used to be a joint venture between the Venezuelan state company and some U.S. Oil companies. Now, because of that, the other interesting point there is that Venezuela doesn't have refineries, so Venezuela actually cannot process its own gasoline. So it's dependent on exporting its oil to yeah, so I see the comment here. Citgo is Venezuelan oil. If you see one, we have their oil. So yes, Narwhal is exactly right. Citgo is Venezuelan oil, and there was at one point a Citgo ad that had pictures of Chavez and other politicians back when he was in vogue, which actually made me want to throw up when I saw it. But that did happen, and so that is largely, I believe, why the link is still there. I think in many places in politics, you'll see groups or entities that seem to have a public sort of narrative of not being friendly, but in the background, they're actually never stop doing deals with each other. And I think that's very much the case with the kind of U.S. Venezuela relationship.
Got it. Yeah, well, you're absolutely correct that it's a common misconception because I did not realize the sanctions were specifically targeted. I thought they were more broad. I
Mhm.
I mean, I don't know if you guys know. My understanding is the sanctions on Iran is for all their people.
Yeah.
I don't know if that's correct
Yeah,
either though now.
so again, I'll let probably some lawyers in the room confirm, but that is the case. My understanding is that some countries, like North Korea, for instance, they are
Right.
fully sanctioned as a country. But there are others, like Venezuela, where the rogue criminals, which actually are elected officials, ironically, are the only ones that are sanctioned. The rest of the people are not. And the intent here was really the intent of the U.S. was to say, they were trying to be as explicit as possible that this was not meant to hurt the Venezuelan people, only the bad people in Venezuela. But of course, the Venezuelan government is going to try to paint a completely different picture, right? And so one group was trying to say, hey, this is how we did it. The other one was trying to say, completely a lie. But as you can tell, once any regime, whether it's Venezuela or any other, actually, this is something that is not talked about enough in Venezuela. But so Chavez, when he came in, the first thing he did is rewrote the constitution. The second thing he did is he dismantled every single media outlet that was against him. So in Venezuela, in the 4 years after Chavez was elected, Ale, do you have the number? But I think it's over 1,500 radio licenses were revoked.
I don't have the exact number,
Holy
but
shit.
it's crazy, dude. That was hectic. Yeah. Yeah, look, I guess that related to what Mauricio was saying. The problem with Venezuela, and it's all related back to what we were just discussing. This it's basically the government swallowing limitlessly the different economic apparatus and parts of the industry in the country. So a huge problem with Venezuela and the bad administrative policies was that essentially, Chavez started expropriating companies in Venezuela. So Chavez, for example, made public the national state oil company PDVSA, right, that we were just talking about, that has its subsidiary Citgo in the U.S. That used to be a private company, man. I mean, like, over the 30s and 40s, the first main highways in Germany were built using Venezuelan asphalt, right? So during Chavez's presidency, over $1.5 trillion in revenue fell into the hands of PDVSA. And so essentially completely into the hands of the government because it became a public company. Then Chavez started nationalizing banks, nationalizing factories, whatever, man, you name it. So it's just to say that the more control over the money supply and the revenues of a certain country or whatever, the more you give to the state, the more greedy they will just get, man. Honestly, that's part of what I lived in a short summary way in Venezuela, dude.
So I mean, on that note, so in a lot of ways, so we see these countries, they move to dollars because that is what they know. It's accessible. It's the undisputed world champion in fiat currencies. Aren't they kind of just? Are we ending up in a situation? I know Mauricio said earlier, like, we shouldn't expect like a hyperinflationary event in the United States anytime soon. But we are seeing, the official inflation numbers are coming out at like 7%, which is historically pretty high for the United States, and that's a discounted number for all intents and purposes. It's probably much higher. That's the one they're willing to admit. Are we like? Is the world putting all of their eggs in one basket, so to speak? Like, are we just compounding risk instead of, you have all these countries that mismanage their treasuries, mismanage their currencies, and then if we're all moving towards a single country's currency, when that eventually collapses, it's going to be way worse. No.
It's a very good point, Matt. The way I see this, the way I kind of see the transition into, say, like, from one fiat to the other is really, it's hard to kind of put it to words, but it's almost a fiat is nothing more than a belief, right? Like the power of the dollar is just as good as your belief in that the United States will be able to manage their finances accordingly and meet their obligations, right? Like that is really all that backs fiat, is the belief in whoever the operator is of that fiat, right? Like the in how you manage the issuance of that fiat relative to your reserves and relative to like the other value that you can create within your economy. Now, what happens, what I see happens when a country's currency fails and it moves to, say, a different country, is that country loses a tremendous amount of independence because it loses its right to do seigniorage. So it essentially is now bound by the monetary policy that the United States has. It puts the US government at a massive advantage relative to other governments because it can control its monetary policy and others cannot. So it really, whether we're making the problem bigger, I mean, we're just trading one problem for another, right? Like we're trading what we're basically saying is this particular group is unable to manage their books, and we're going to use the currency of the group that we believe can manage their books. To your point, if we start seeing concerns or doubts start to emerge around the US being able to maintain its book, then you might see people interested in other monetary instruments. And that might be Bitcoin, or that might be the country that is doing things better, come 10 years from now or 5 years from now, if the US stops or, starts creating doubts.
So do you think it's a valid perspective that the way we've seen dollarization happen in these other countries is the way we will see Bitcoinization happen as the dollar fails? Or is it not a complete analogy?
I'll let Mauricio expand further into that, but yeah, like if I look, I lived the hyper dollarization process of Venezuela and had been, I mined in the country back in 2013, 2015, and then I had some hope that more, we would have seen more retail adoption, although it's pretty big in Venezuela, and we could dive more into that, but truly. It went already through a hyper dollarization process, and that's what eventually starts, grinding down towards hyper Bitcoinization and more usage of Bitcoin. As some people start understanding Bitcoin in these countries as a more, rapid and less costly medium of exchange to reach other local currencies and make international payments, because the other problem is, okay, right, the problem with hyper dollarization is if it's done in cash, sweet, but then it's a dollarization that will live just if the banking system of that particular country does not embrace the dollar as legal tender and does not abide to the rules and the regulations of US, then and if you're not essentially agreeing or goodwill trading partner of the US's, then there's no way to provide like real global exposure to that dollarization. And so it's just a closed door, it's a closed doors economy, you know what I mean? Like and so that's and then we'd have to speak about, of course, the problem of confiscation, right? uh, uh, England confiscated Venezuela's gold. If you don't use dollar, and if you don't have access to using dollars in the global banking system, what are you going to use other than gold? You just have Bitcoin. You know what I mean? And so I'll let Mauricio give his take on that.
Yeah, it's a really good point, Matt. I think if you look at, if I try to look at things as sort of human events, and I think when somebody thinks macro and how this happens or how that happens, I like to think of macro events as a combination of just individual actions. Okay, and if you look at how or why people drop the bolivar for the dollar, or why somebody would drop the dollar for a bolivar, or sorry, the dollar for Bitcoin, in my view, it happens a little bit like this. And for this, I want to give a quick story about mining in Venezuela, which I think can illuminate a lot of things about how this transfer of knowledge happens. So the way people don't find out about dollars or hyperinflation or inflation all at the same time. They do this by living certain experiences and seeing people do certain things. So I'll give you an example. When we first started setting up mines and building and installing miners in Venezuela, we were using the electrical contractors that came from the from residential construction, because that's what my dad used to do. And so we started calling up our electricians to help us do the sort of electrical upgrades that we did to run the power feeds to our miners and to set up our networks and to bring in our sort of internet our internet networks, like our LAN networks. And in the first time around they came, they were like, "Oh, this is cool." You know, we were installing miners and building something in the time where everything else in Venezuela was falling apart. So naturally they were curious and they were like, "Oh, what are you doing this big installation for?" And we said, "Oh, we're going to install these machines. They mine these things called Bitcoin." And so the second time around, we called them up for a second installation. And when they came to do the second installation, they saw that we were, growing and that we were installing more. And they said, "Hey, what is this Bitcoin thing? Where can I learn more about it? Can you tell me a bit more about it?" And there was very little Spanish resources, but we kind of pointed them out in a few directions. And a few months later, we called them back for a third installation. And when they came in for the third installation, they said, "This time I want to get paid in Bitcoin." And they had their addresses and they were able to receive Bitcoin for payment. And what I'm trying to say is, people emulate when people see other people doing well and they're doing a certain action and that action leads them to them doing well, people emulate that action. So the same way these people saw us installing miners and got interested in Bitcoin, other people will see other people spend and hold dollars over bolivares, and they will then start emulating that, and they will benefit from it. They'll run their math at the end of the week, and they said, "Holy crap, I am better off." And then they start moving on to dollars. And eventually, I think the migration to Bitcoin is actually going to be very similar to your point, Matt, because it's going to start out of necessity, and governments are likely going to fight it at first. But there will be a government or a group in that government that says, this is inevitable. So they get behind it and they rally the population, and then it becomes law. And so I think we're going to see that's how I picture it transitioning. But I do not think that that governments are going to do this without a fight. I do think that there will be some contentious part of this journey, and we just need to be ready for it.
I mean, you crystallized something there that I talk about a lot, which is, which I think is lost on most Americans and probably Europeans as well, and Canadians, and is this idea of necessity, this idea of actually realizing there is a need for something better and going out and seeking it.
Yep.
Right. Like that is the key, right? As people start to realize the need, they will seek out a better alternative. And we basically just need to be ready with tools, resources, education for people when they realize that need, rather than necessarily trying to convince someone to use Bitcoin that doesn't necessarily need it.
I mean, 100%. And it happened to me that way, right? Like, I dived into Bitcoin because of necessity. My family lost its savings, almost all of its savings in 2008 with the great financial crisis. And the only thing that allowed me as a Venezuelan after that, and the whole, depression of the Venezuelan economy, they completely wiped out all of our savings and local currency as well. Jurisdiction doesn't work. It's only based on trust and paying somebody nowadays. It's been Bitcoin. So I do, and then the other thing, in the case of Venezuela, that creates a need. It's like if you leave the country and you go to, say, Spain, wherever, right? You still have to go through this bureaucratic normal process of establishing yourself as a resident of that country. And until you don't do that, you don't have access to banking, you can't have a job, you can't do anything, and you continue living in the informal economy. And what I learned by that is that the best way to the best way to monetize the informal economy is through cryptocurrency peer-to-peer markets. And so essentially I made a living out of, peer-to-peer arbitrage by arbitraging different currencies in South America by using, local Bitcoins or whatever. So go ahead.
let's talk about that a little bit, because
Mm-hmm.
so I have a buddy who is only a buddy because he's a Bitcoiner, and he's from Colombia. By the way, this is one of the coolest aspects of being active in the Bitcoin community, is that I just feel like I have friends around the world who I have not
Yeah.
met yet in person, but that I can just have these great conversations with. And he mentioned that in Colombia, the main way people are buying Bitcoin and selling Bitcoin and trading is through Binance peer-to-peer marketplace, which is something that was just not even on my radar at all. Like, we all know local Bitcoins, we know Paxful, but apparently Binance's P2P market is blowing the fuck up. Do you guys
Yeah.
have any insight on that?
You hear
All
the
of them.
Latinos giggling. You hear the Latinos giggling.
Dude, I have all of them, honestly. Look, Binance peer-to-peer market, the Binance peer-to-peer marketplace started booming in South America after, Sir Bitcoin, Paxful, local Bitcoins, whatever. There's so many. Because they introduced the first peer-to-peer marketplace that used stable coins. In this case, dollar tether. So the problem that most of this, let's call them informal OTCs, or again, the term that it's generally used in the financial world and the banking world, is informal money transmitters. The problem that this cryptocurrency informal money transmitters or informal OTCs had with Bitcoin peer-to-peer marketplaces was essentially volatility, right? So it was a problem that you were charging someone between 1% to 2%, or even 3% sometimes, right? To essentially receive the local currency and make a payment for them in dollars wherever, right? And so you made 1% to 2% on one side of the trade, and then you made 1% to 2% on the other side of the trade by selling Bitcoin to a Bitcoin buyer in another country, right? To access dollars in the other country. So, or whichever currency. It could be Colombian pesos or Peruvian soles or whatever. Again, the problem with that was volatility. So whenever you were carrying on a trade, and within a matter of hours, Bitcoin dropped like 5% or 10%, whatever, you were essentially losing all of your profits. So it was a thing about speed and liquidity in the market. As peer-to-peer marketplaces started booming and being more used in South America, then Binance really understood that, and they really cashed in that opportunity, and they really solved the volatility problem by essentially just pegging dollar tether to a peer-to-peer marketplace. And so that's essentially why Binance is currently functioning as the backend for peer-to-peer trades, especially being done in South America.
But that's very interesting. How do the users get Tether? Are they getting Bitcoin first, and then they're just, when they want to
No,
sell, they're just
so
holding Tether? Or
No, so the it's basically the way Binance innovated, and I'll let Ale confirm this because he uses these platforms more than I do. I have just heard anecdotally from a lot of my friends, but what I essentially, Matt, it goes back to this idea of Bitcoin versus dollars, and what became very clear. Or what Binance saw, and in some ways, what we have seen, but we can get into that later. But Venezuela and Latin America in general has a huge appetite for dollars on crypto rails. So it's hard to explain because most people listening to this will have likely held dollars and transacted in dollars, and they've never had an issue sending dollars around the world. But to a Venezuelan, to be told that you can send $1 to Mexico, Colombia, the US, Spain, and that you don't have to go through your bank to do that. Most Venezuelans face a world of restrictions to move dollars around. Most people outside of the US do. In fact, I remember, just so that you guys know how terrible this is, my family had some of our dollars in a bank account in Panama, as did many other Venezuelans. And there was one time we were trying to pay for a surgery for one of my relatives. And this surgery was going to the Anderson Clinic in Texas. And they were the wire recipient. We were not allowed to wire that money. It took us 2 weeks to wire that money. And it was an emergency surgery. So just to give you the excruciating, I don't even want to use bad words. I'm trying to limit my language. But when you're trying to move dollars outside of the US, you're made to feel like a criminal. And that is fucking unacceptable in my books. So when you give somebody in that part of the world $1 on crypto rails, you are literally changing the realm of opportunities that person ever had a chance to transact with. So yes, Bitcoin is amazing, but it takes people a really long time to understand it and why it's important and how it works. If it's much simpler to explain $1 on crypto rails that you can send to anyone. And I think that's why stablecoins are going to be such a great segue into Bitcoin. And so I think
they're basically getting a lot of the benefits that Bitcoin provides without having to understand the necessarily like the monetary policy specifics.
Bang on.
But still, how is Tether entering that economy? Is it entering?
It's just what's available.
Or
it's just what's available, and it's stable. Maybe Ale, you can take this one.
Do they have like? Are there places where you can just exchange cash directly for Tether? Is that the entry point?
Dude, that's a thing now. But that was not the case 4 to 5 years ago, man. And so what happened? What happened was essentially this. Look, Venezuela is still functioning as the it's the heartbeat for Latin American peer-to-peer volume, cryptocurrency peer-to-peer volume. So back in 2019, if you look at local Bitcoin's volume in Venezuela, it was being transacted like around 2,500 Bitcoin per week. Right now, that came down to like 30 Bitcoin. Sometimes it's like 40 Bitcoin. Because, you do have to take into account the Venezuelan economy shrinking and Bitcoin going up in price, etc. So before Tether, it was all Bitcoin. When Tether joined the scenes, Tether was not a trusted thing within all of these, again, OTC dealers, whatever. I did this for a living in Venezuela, right? So essentially, at some point, after the 2017 bull run in Bitcoin, some of us cashed out and put some money within exchanges and stable coins or whatever. And that's how really it started growing, this usage and understanding of stable coins. Like, what is the stable coin thing? What can I do with it? Whatever. So the problem was that before they were they became part of this peer-to-peer markets, and right now even Paxful has USDT as well, right? Nobody cared about that, honestly. It was mostly a thing that people that were trying to do trading on exchanges were getting. That's how people started getting familiarized with Tether. But right now, after seeing the usage of stable coins evolve throughout all this past 5 years, whatever, dude, you go to play soccer with your crypto buddies, Bitcoin buddies or whatever in Venezuela, and you would see people making payments between each other in dollar tether, man, in Binance purely. So I guess that it's a mixture of the people that are early adopters and mine Bitcoin early stages in countries with cheap electricity rates like Venezuela or Argentina or Paraguay, etc. And then you have you have to add this whole, informal money transmitters and OTC dealers that were dealing with digital assets for their daily operations as the underlying currencies. And then you have the traders, unexperienced traders or whatever you want to call them. And then now you have the layer of, businesses and day-to-day people that understand that, okay, I need to travel all the way to the US. I need to have access to an address in the US just to own a bank account in the US. My bank account can get frozen. I need to spend sometimes hours, days, if not weeks, trying to reach out to customer support at my US bank, right? Sometimes I make a Zelle payment of $100 and my account gets frozen or blocked, and yada yada yada. Same story. You have to reach out to customer success from the XYZ bank in the US or Panama or whatever. So it's right now, to Mauricio's point, it's just a more comfortable and accessible way of moving dollars within payment rails. That it's pretty much it, and in a purely digital manner, right? Because you don't have to travel anywhere. You just need an email, a phone number, and set up a TOTP security on your phone or whatever. And so you essentially have access to dollars and your phone, and I think that's how it started evolving. Honestly,
So it was Bitcoiners who brought it in,
exactly.
right? They already had Bitcoin, so they had access to Tether, and then it spread from there.
And like, I'll give you another example. I have a buddy of mine that used to have this Western Union franchise, right, in Peru. Eventually, this dude started mining with us in Venezuela. And then he said, so wait, I have a better way for doing the same thing that I'm doing with Western Union, but with this local Bitcoins thing that you're showing me. So why don't I try to plug that as a backend for my Western Union business, just so that I can make more money and and move it faster, move it more times, keep the wheel spinning, but at a faster pace, and just make more profits with the same infrastructure that I have. But I'm just opening myself an account at a marketplace, similar to opening an account in Amazon or Mercado Libre or whatever, right? So what you're seeing in South America is an increasing trend, an ever increasing trend of even traditional money remittance services and money transmittance services diving into digital assets because it's just cheaper, faster, quicker, better.
Well, I definitely feel that. I appreciate the insight, guys. So, I mean, so with this reliance on, are you guys concerned? Are you guys concerned about the reliance on stablecoins? Like, they are pretty much all centralized. Tether is a massive regulatory target. Do you is that something that's on your radar, or do you think it's overblown?
So I think going back to your concept or your question about, are we trading one problem for another by letting these countries use a dollar rather than their own local currency? I think what I see in this, in the way people are behaving and the stable coins and the choices that they're making, is essentially they're saying, yes, I may not know who's behind this Tether organization. I may not know who's behind this other group that is managing these other assets, but I do know what my option is. And my option is staying in my broken system, which will certainly lead me to failure. And so, again, it's really, if you think Tether is bad, like you should see the books of the Venezuelan government. You know what I mean? And I think that that's what people are saying. When the people that you see go into Tether, they don't have the greatest central banks in the world. They may not have the full information, to your point, Matt. And if they did know everything they need to know, they may choose to use something else. But I think that they're making this decision based on what they know. And I think what is sometimes missed by people outside of North America or Europe is how much fear there is and how much power a country has when it turns against you or your group of friends or your peers or your industry. And in Latin America, we've seen the government expropriate our savings from the bank. That's happened many times. We've seen governments expropriate assets like factories, houses, farms. So we have very shaken property assurances. So what you see is people that have very little trust in the tools that are at their disposal, and they're willing to place blind faith almost on these options that other people are using. So I think it's basically trading one problem for the other. But what I think is important to highlight is, as bad and as scary as we think some operators of these coins might be, the people that are switching to these operators see way scarier boogeymen and way scarier outcomes if they don't move over to Tether, if that makes sense.
Right. I mean, ultimately, everything has trade-offs, right? I mean, I think
Yeah.
most people wouldn't argue against the fact that using something like Tether gives you additional censorship-resistant guarantee. Like Tether has been frozen and seized, but compared to something like Zelle or a traditional bank wire or something, it is obviously a massive improvement on that trade-off balance.
Yeah, the other assumption that I want to challenge there briefly is the idea that you have privacy in some of these authoritarian countries. Like, there is no privacy in Venezuela. If the Venezuelan government knows everything you do in the banking system, they have a system that knows how many times you've been to the doctor, how many cars you drive, how many pets you have, how many kids you have. So the surveillance state is already here. I think a lot of people just don't really appreciate that.
I mean, on that point, there was a lot of writing and articles about the Venezuelan government seizing Bitcoin mining operations. Do
I
you
was
guys
one
have
of
any
them.
insight on that?
I was one of them.
You want to talk about that at all, or?
Sure. So where to start? So as many Venezuelans, back in the day, when the first type of a group of Venezuelans got into Bitcoin, we many quickly saw this connection between Venezuela and subsidized electricity and our strict currency control that enabled us or prevented us from protecting our savings. And they saw Bitcoin and they saw mining and connected the two dots in a very similar way that China did, and we can get into that in a second. They started using Bitcoin to essentially extract an incentive that was being provided by the government by way of subsidies, and essentially use Bitcoin to be well better off in a system that did not let you acquire dollars at the time. So a lot of people start mining Bitcoin and they start doing really well. At first it was a bit secretive. People were scared. They didn't know how the government was going to react. But it wasn't illegal. So my family and I, we were so excited. We were just telling everyone that would come to us and helping them how to mine, set up facilities, figure out the electrical work, and essentially started helping many people set up their mines. And mining starts getting quite viral in Venezuela because you were getting, I remember back in the day, you were getting like $300 to $400 a month from a rig, and minimum wage in Venezuela was about $20. So people were getting like 20 times minimum wage by just setting up a rig. Even if it was a GPU or ASIC, they were kind of the revenue at the time. And so what happens, and this is where the petro comes into the story. And what happens is this is happening in the middle of the ICO boom. The Venezuelan government, oh man, this is going to be a long story, but I have to tell it. So the Venezuelan government, once Chavez died and they started facing issues, they got on this trend that every year towards Christmas, when people were most upset, because usually by then, people were just mad that they didn't have money going up to Christmas to buy gifts, and the country was just in shambles. So they would find a way to do giveaways. So in 2017, they took the largest electronics company in the country, so like equivalent to like Venezuela and Best Buy. And they went into Best Buy and took all of their stores countrywide and said that these stores had been bringing in goods at speculative prices, and that the government had essentially slashed all of their prices by like 70%, and they were going to distribute them to the people for Christmas. And so, of course, people lined up to get 40-inch TVs for $20. And they absolutely raided the inventory and stock of this company, and this company essentially crashed and ceased existing. It could never recover from that. But the government had happy voters for another few months. The year after that, they did the same thing with a big shoe company. They essentially basically seized all their inventory, slashed it in prices and gave it away to people. And again, photo ops for people walking out with 7 pairs of shoes for $7. And obviously, as companies caught on to this, they stopped bringing inventory. And come Christmas 2000, and I believe this was 2017, right around the peak of the market, nobody had inventory. Nobody had been bringing inventory of the year because they want to be the idiots that were going to be giving away free Christmas gifts. And basically, the year was coming to an end. There was nothing to give away. And I don't really have specific data for this, but I think what went down was something like this. Maduro is trying to keep his crony officials happy. Crony officials are getting upset because they're looking at Christmas and they're not going to get free money. And so they say, what are you going to do for us? And Maduro says, bring me all the importation records for what's been brought into the country this year. And there was a name that kept recurring throughout 2017 as importers of shipping goods into Venezuela, and that name was Bitmain. And so they dug a little bit deeper in Bitmain, and they saw that these machines literally printed dollars or Bitcoin. And they said, oh my God, there are machines that print dollars, and they are in this country. How can we redistribute these machines to our cronies? And they devised this marvelous plan that involved announcing a fake new cryptocurrency, so that by promoting this fake new cryptocurrency, they could educate their cronies on what these mining machines look like and basically instruct them that they could go take them from these people and then start mining dollars for themselves. And so this is where the petro push starts. And if you look at the petro, and if you look at the promotional materials that were done for the petro, they all revolved around mining equipment. And they would show ASICs and they would show GPU rigs. And you want to hear something funny? The petro was never, there were never any miners for the petro. The petro could not be mined. It's a closed network. So what these petro advertisements were was in fact education campaigns so that people could identify miners, understand miners, and then go seize them from the people that were legally mining in the country. Right after the petro promotion, we and many other miners around the country started seeing new strange visitors into our mining facilities. And they would come dressed as utility people. They would come dressed as mostly utility people. Surely, a few days later, these utility people revealed themselves as not utility people. And they started essentially harassing miners, threatening miners to seize equipment, threatening miners to shut down their facilities. And then miners essentially, reneged, and they were basically all the miners like ourselves that did not want to accept that and would not ever get in bed with that type of government, we basically rolled up our facilities and left. But what the government did is they continued seizing machines from a bunch of people. In fact, some of the machines that were shipped to Venezuela were actually stolen from us at the dock. And the shipping company called us to tell us that they had been stolen. And when we asked what we could do about it, we were told that the last person that had gone and asked about what happened with their mining equipment was told never to go back to the army office where they went to pose the question. So fast forward until today, what ended up happening is the government, of course, they saw something that could benefit people or themselves, and they decided to help themselves. Of course, they've created this entity called SUNACRIP. SUNACRIP is the national cryptocurrency body. Of course, it is one of the sanctioned bodies. One of the few fully sanctioned bodies in Venezuela is the SUNACRIP. And another fully sanctioned part of Venezuela is the petro, and anyone that has to do with the petro, ironically enough. So SUNACRIP created a national pool, and it forces every Venezuelan miner to send their payouts to the government-run pool. And then they have to trust the government to disperse your Bitcoin back to you as a miner. So yeah, I'll pause there, but I'd love to hear your thoughts on that pool, Matt.
So, I mean, this is I appreciate that's some story right there. So a couple of things to unpack there. First of all, you said your family disbanded their mining operation and moved it out of the country. You literally got the mining rigs out of the country.
We did not. We sold them to people locally that wanted to continue mining.
And then you can set up shop somewhere else if you want to.
Yeah, so the way out was, there's obviously a lot more nuance to the way out. In fact, what ended up happening was they raided one of my brother's facilities. They threatened us to send us or place charges against us. They tried to threaten with all these weird, scary sounding charges and allegations. Of course, legally, that's all been, we won that case. There's, we set the record straight. There's absolutely nothing wrong with what we did. But at the time, as Ale will, and then many other Venezuelans will know, like, Venezuela is a very lawless place. So everyone's going to try to bully you into something, and it's really a dog-eat-dog world. So basically, we did not play ball with those guys at the time, with the cronies at the time, and we instead decided to take it up in court and clean it up that way, and that's what happened.
Got it. Well, I mean, there was a lot there. The other thing I want to unpack, the petro still exists, right? Like, aren't they? Is it true that they're like giving it out as welfare as well? Like, you get if you register, you get free petro, or
yeah, because essentially it's just to basically related to what Mauricio was saying. It's again just like a government ran social program. So there's like this special ID in Venezuela, which is like a if you issue yourself that ID, then you have the ability to register in the Petro app, which is essentially like a national wallet. So similar to like the Chiva wallet in El Salvador, but in this case, it's like connected to the Venezuelan government's monetary network, so to speak. So it's more like to put it into context, I think it's kind of like a national PayPal. You know what I mean? So that's like the Petro doesn't have any blockchain. You can make Petro payments within the national app.
And so they don't even have a centralized. There's not even like a centralized blockchain attached to it. It's just completely.
Yeah, it's a local shitcoin.
Exactly.
Right, but like they haven't even gone the full. It's not even. It's not. It hasn't even hit shitcoin status, right? Like it doesn't even have a blockchain, or
you can't run a node. You cannot run a node.
Okay, gotcha.
Exactly. So it was supposed to be launched as a federated network, and essentially the initial white paper of the Petro that came out back in 2017 was a hard fork of Dash. So it was built on X11. It was supposed to be built on X11 on the X11 algorithm, right? Um, that never happened. And then just the Sunacrypt government body that Mauricio was talking about, they just changed the dude that was like the minister of this government body. They changed them like twice or three times or whatever, and so plans would just change. It's mostly based on purely lobbying, you know what I mean? And it essentially became just like the closer you got to Sunacrypt, the closer you had the opportunity of being granted a permit to become, a cryptocurrency exchange in Venezuela, so that you could legally build a platform to onboard users, and then receive their bolivars, and then you could legally go to private banks or even public banks in the country, and open up a corporate treasury account to receive bolivares under your Venezuelan corporation. And then there's some like but this is really sketchy level Petro thing, which is like Petro arbitrage traders, which is essentially people that would buy Petro at discounted prices from other people, because they would pay them in cash or whatever. And so you would essentially be buying Petros at like 70% discount or whatever. And then these people would either change Petro for gas at gas stations, because you could get discount rates at Venezuelan gas stations if you pay with the Petro, essentially, at certain gas stations at least. And so there's
Well,
different ways to
the gas stations down there are state owned, right? Are all of them state
exactly
owned, or
all,
Yeah,
almost
all of
all
yeah,
them,
of
all
them?
of
man.
them, all of them.
It's all a government sham trying to get you to use the petro. And again, it all comes back to optics. So if you have two currencies at the same time, you can inflate the two of them, and you'll have two separate rates of inflation, and you won't pile on the whole inflation onto one of them. Does that make sense?
It's
Because
so fucked up.
it's all optics, bro. It's all a game of optics. And the petro was nothing more than a tool to manipulate optics.
But you
And
keep talking about it in the past tense, like it still exists, right? Like
oh
people
well,
are,
I've already written it off as some bullshit token. Like whoever's using it, I can't help you if you're still using the petro, bro. Like you're lost. Like
but people are, right?
no, I mean the only people that I would argue are using the petro are people that are being lied to, and people that are being told people that are getting complete misrepresentations about what this thing does. The people that are using Bitcoin today, or sorry, the petro today, are the same people that still believe in Chavez's government plan. So
Yeah.
like you will still have those people. They're just hopeless.
Yeah. Like, dude, you
I
can't
feel
cash
that.
out of the Petro. Like, you can't cash out of the Petro. You would see Petros in your national Bolivarian wallet or whatever, but you can't cash out of that thing, and nobody wants to get near that thing, to the
Are there
point that
no are there no like Bitcoin petro markets or
I would
no,
mean,
alternative
there.
petro
no
markets?
Bitcoiner would be caught dead doing that. Like no real Bitcoiner would ever accept that. You know what I mean? Like they know too much. They know so much better than to accept the petro. At least if anybody that's taking the petro right now is trying to pull a fast one, thinking that they know more than someone else, and most likely they're gonna get cut. There's a saying in Spanish that I remember oftentimes that says, "If you like butter, butter in Venezuela used to come in a tin can." So there's a saying that says, if you like dipping your finger into the butter can to eat the butter, you may cut yourself when you do that. And so what that is meant to say is, if you like easy money and if you look at easy things, like you will get cut. Like there is a very good chance you'll get cut because it's very risky.
Yeah, that makes sense to me. Too good to be true.
Correct.
Um,
Correct.
so then the other interesting thing to unpack from your story is the Venezuelan government mining. So you said there's a government mining pool. Presumably that mining pool is not a public mining pool, so it's registered in the unknown if you look at one of the mining pool charts. Would you agree with the statement that the Venezuelan government is the single largest government-based mining operation that exists in the world today?
I don't know Turkey, but there's a very good chance.
Is Turkey mining Bitcoin, the government?
They have a pool as well, my understanding.
Oh, I wasn't aware of that.
Yeah, I believe they have
Right.
a mining pool. Hold on, Turkey.
Right. So if I were
Pretty
to
sure they
provide some
announced this.
insight,
Hit us.
like look, Matt, all of this amazing conversation that we've had so far between the three of us, it all brings back, if you notice, if you go deep into it, to 2017. 2017 was the year of hyperinflation in Venezuela. 2017 was the year that dollarization started like ticking up in Venezuela. 2017 was the year that the Venezuelan government introduced their plans to, launch a petro. 2017 was the year when the Venezuelan regime got sanctioned by the US. And 2017 was the same year, because of all that scene of events, that the Venezuelan government started, seizing mining equipment, from people that were essentially mining Bitcoin in the country. Because for a great period of time, that was like a black hole year, dude, in Venezuela. And the government not being able to move their dollars, their euros deposited in EU bank accounts, their gold deposited in gold vaults, right, in England, their dollars deposited at Citibank in the US. I'm sorry. So what else could you do to finance yourself other than using the already almost like wiped out local currency? Mine Bitcoin with your cheap electricity rates. And before you started figuring out, as a government, right, like how am I gonna buy this mining equipment? Where does this actually come from? How do I set up this? It was essentially trying to tap into the already existing mining infrastructure that was built in the country. And so tapping into private individuals that would try to agree to go rogue, to Mauricio's point, and did not agree, your mining equipment was just seized. So
it was easier to extort individuals or pressure
Exactly.
individuals than start
Yes.
from scratch.
Exactly.
Yeah, and so one thing that I will say that just to challenge the idea that Venezuelan government could be mining Bitcoin is, one, they are the most inept and incompetent group of people I have ever come across. So I do not know that they even have the capacity to organize themselves to mine for their own collective good. I have a feeling that a lot of these miners were ad hoc assigned to their top cronies so that they could mine for themselves, and they would basically come off the payroll. Right. So I think they've given a bunch of generals or army this or army that, like a set amount of miners to sort of, keep them happy. But there are two things that I know to be true. One is these are very short-term oriented and not very sort of intelligent in terms of financing. And the second one is I don't think they have the capacity or the resources to have invested or grown beyond the machines or the assets that they extorted from people that had already done that work. Basically, is they saw something that was working and they took it, but they are incapable of building something that works from scratch.
Yeah, I mean, that makes sense to me. I guess in a lot of ways, probably even excluding Bitcoin, right? When someone says like the Venezuelan government, it's really a collection of cronies, right? Rather than like some.
It depends on who you ask, but for sure, in my view.
So, I mean, the story of Venezuela is really interesting, especially how it relates to Bitcoin and the broader ecosystem there, where it's like almost it's a story of the people getting fucked by their local, uh, their local, their local economy, and then it's a story of the government getting fucked by the global economy, right? Like the global financial system. Like the local financial system failed the individuals, and then the global financial system failed the government, both at the same time, and both kind of moved towards Bitcoin and the greater ecosystem.
Yeah, I would challenge this idea that the world, the financial world, failed Venezuela. I think Venezuela was responsible for their own failure. They still have all the resources to do things right, but they just chose not to. And
Well, I meant like specifically like the gold in the UK vaults, uh, European bank accounts, stuff like that, right?
yeah, and listen, at the end of the day, this is a very difficult thing for me to answer because I'll speak very candidly. Okay, um, when you are in a country and you see a government literally chase a group of people out of the country and rob every opportunity that they had, take away their factories, make it impossible for them to hire people, make them unable to access financing, make them unable to buy dollars. You are essentially kicking people out of their own country. And you're doing this not through democratic means, you're doing this by force. You're doing this as you're getting millions of people on the street protesting. And when people go out and protest, what did you do? Maduro went out and shot them. I had friends literally, and this is going to sound dramatic, but I actually had friends, people I knew, died in protests trying to get a recount of our election that was clearly stolen. When you see a group of criminals chase a group of hardworking, honest individuals out of their own country, and you see what they're trying to do, I do not I have a really hard time, even though I am a Bitcoiner and even though I believe in open, permissionless access to transactions, I do think that there is the possibility that very, very bad agents can get circumstantially a lot of power. And we, as a global society, should have checks and balances so that we can bring that bad agent or prevent that bad agent from causing damage in other parts of the world. And I thought, as a Venezuelan, we have been going through this for 20 years, 25 years. This has been going on for. Or Chavez came in 99. That's been 23 years. 23 years, man. In 2017, that was 5 years ago, after we had already been going through the grind for 18 years. For the first time ever, the US government stood up and said, what you are doing is wrong. The government of Venezuela should not be called the government. They should be called a group of terrorists. And they sanctioned them. And you know how that made me feel? Like there was a little bit of justice in the world. And of course it didn't work because they're still there. They kicked out my family. They kicked out Ale. They kicked out all of us. And they've separated all of our families. They've broken our finances. They've given us a new life, sure, in a different country, all separated. But I worry about the world losing its ability to, I would say, without the use of force, because you can still coerce somebody by twisting their arm financially without having to go use force. But we were unable to do that. And the Venezuelan government, because they have this magical thing that comes from the ground that is oil, they can literally sit there and have zero popular support from their voting population, but they still have the resources to keep them all down from rising up. And they will stay that way until someone's willing to do something. And we won't. So for us in Venezuela, that just means we have to write off the fucking country, and we had to leave because we knew nobody was going to come in and do things right. So I do not think that Venezuela now being able to access their gold or their dollars is necessarily all that bad, because if they had, I don't know what would have happened in Venezuela.
Yeah, agreed.
So-
And I guess
yeah,
at an
go.
interesting point there. Yeah, sorry about that. I guess at an interesting point to bring up and shed some light on, right? Is whenever Travis president and you were, a government contractor, or you did some project with the government, or even if it was the state oil company or whatever, right, or public bank, the perception was that you were doing business directly or indirectly, whatever, with the Venezuelan government, right? Which was okay. But right now, to be completely honest, the perception and the vibe is that you are doing business with the most powerful families in Venezuela, which are five families, which are essentially the five families that divide between themselves the $25 billion in revenue coming from oil that Venezuela receives every single year. So it's $5 billion going to each one of these families, and you're no longer doing business with the Venezuelan government, or you're no longer being paid with the country's money, the citizens' money, or whatever. You're being paid. Their mentality is that you're being paid with their money. You know what I mean? So it's like Venezuela got to, it's like oligarchs. Honestly, they're oligarchs, dude, and it's fucking crazy. It's similar to like this Russian oligarchs thing or whatever. By the way, just a side note comment, Matt, I sent you via private message on a Twitter chat with Mauricio some screenshots of Crypto Lago. Crypto Lago is essentially the only cryptocurrency exchange in Venezuela that has a marketplace for petros. And you were, I sent you like a screenshot of there. I only have a user just to peek into that from night. You will see that it only has a liquidity of 20 petros. 20 petros by $90. That what's currently more or less trading the barrel of oil right now in international markets. What is that like? Nothing, dude. like not even $2,000, man. Right, worth of liquidity in petros at a national exchange. So it's a complete failure.
Yeah, I'm gonna pull those screenshots up on screen shortly. Before I do that, first of all, I mean, obviously, this whole it's complete fucking tragedy what happened to your country. I absolutely hate to see it, but I feel like Mauricio touched on a very interesting conversation there in terms of sanctions. Um, I mean, if Bitcoin is successful as we expect it to be, that cat is kind of out of the bag. Like, how do you circle that? How do you circle that square? Like, there. I mean, to protect. To the way I always looked at it is to protect a dissident or opposition or protester or refugee from exclusion from the financial system from a dictator or an authoritarian. The trade-off there is that a dictator and authoritarian is also going to have that same type of access in terms of the global financial system. And this is a topic that I think is just not often discussed in Bitcoin land, just because it's so sensitive.
Yeah.
How do you feel about that? Like, do you think it's a net benefit? Do you think it ends up in a worse situation, or?
I'm gonna give you my heartfelt answer. There's one thing that I believe that is true, and that is that there are more good people trapped in bad regimes than bad people, that need to be that can be empowered by an open currency. So I do think at a base level that this will have a net benefit to the world, because I think that there are more people being treated unfairly under these wild regimes than there is an absolute number of bad regimes, right? It's kind of similar to the internet theory, which is, if you put it out there, people are going to start spreading bad information, but they're going to be spreading good information too, and the good information is going to outnumber the bad by multiples. And so that's kind of why that works. There are obviously trade-offs. As a Bitcoiner, to me, it was a very, very difficult time, 2017, when people were raving about the petro, and where, in many ways, I thought that the Venezuelan government was using, in some ways, Bitcoin to circumvent some of the challenges that were posed by the sanctions, and so much so that a lot of people would reference the P2P volumes in local Bitcoins in Venezuela, and I always thought that was interesting, because I would look at the math and I would speak to my friends and I would try to understand who was on the other side of those trades, and I have a pretty strong inclination that the government was the one buying Bitcoin in those P2P markets with printed fiat, and they were using that Bitcoin to then pay vendors internationally. And so they were flooding the P2P markets with fiat to just acquire Bitcoin in exchange of worthless tokens in a anonymous way.
Right. That makes sense to me.
And so during that time, I was really struggling, because I was finding a new career and a new love in Bitcoin, while at the same time I saw Bitcoin basically being Bitcoin and being open and permissionless, and I couldn't stop, even if I knew that it was them, I couldn't stop them from using it, and I knew that by using it they were benefiting. As much as I would love to stop the Venezuelas from happening, I think if I knew that regardless of where in the world you are, the next time a dictatorial president comes around, you will have the tools to escape, and that tool will be Bitcoin. I think that's a win, because I don't think that we'll be able to predict how humans behave. I think that we just need to arm and educate people so that they can defend themselves against a potential attack, right? So people need to be able to fend for their own. And so as much as I think it's a risk that globally we might lose some of our power to kind of whip some rogue states back in the line, I do think that we can regain that ability by all coming together and try to coerce potential rogue states in a different way that's not choking them out of the financial system.
Yeah, I mean that makes that we're on the same page on that. I mean, in a lot of ways, the way I tend to look at it is maybe it's a little bit different with the Venezuelan government. But the way I look at it is it kind of gives individuals the same power that elites kind of already have in the traditional financial system anyway.
Yeah.
When there's a will, there's a way. When there's resources, there's a way. And the elites tend to figure it out regardless of Bitcoin. So to me, I mean, it's a clear, massive net benefit. And there's no real, I mean, let's be absolutely clear here. Like the U.S. government is not this bastion of good judgment and reason and fairness. There's a lot of misjustice that happens in the traditional financial system that is practically run by the U.S. government. So if you want to guarantee individuals' rights, there's really no way to do it unless you guarantee everyone's rights in a properly permissionless way. So there's really no alternative. There's no alternative where bad people get blocked, but good people don't. So ultimately, you just need to build a system where no one can control it, period. and anyone can use it regardless of where they stand morally or ethically.
Yeah, it's leveling the playing field, right? In many ways, it's making their reserve asset the same as your reserve asset, and you have equal access and equal information to what's going on with that asset.
Right. So I mean, we're getting close to the 2 hour point, where I like to try and uh, keep our discussions to. But before we do, I mean, El Salvador has been a massive topic of conversation with how they adopted legal tender, and also just how President Bukele over there is running things. I'm curious with like your experiences, both of your experiences with Venezuela, Latin America in general. Like, how do you view the whole El Salvador movement towards Bitcoin? How do you view Bukele specifically and his regime? Like, what are your thoughts there on what maybe we might see over the next 2 years? What are your thoughts over what we've seen over the last year? Pretty curious.
Right. So, I mean, Mauricio and I went to El Salvador to represent Latin at La BitConf, right? This was recently in November. I think it
Right.
look as a Venezuelan, right, and taking into consideration that regarding South America, uh, Venezuela is the country with the highest percentage of citizens and families, in this case, families owning a bank account, right? So in the case of El Salvador, Venezuela has like 30 million people. Almost 100% of Venezuelan families own a bank account. So maybe your son doesn't have a bank account, maybe your wife doesn't have a bank account in certain cases, but as a family, you have a bank account, right? In the case of El Salvador, it's completely different, right? So like only 1.2 or roughly 1.5, I don't recall the exact number of people own a bank account in a country that has over 6 million people, right? Over population of over 6 million people. So the thing is that El Salvador, right, if we take into account the numbers that were being provided from the Venezuelan, the El Salvadorian government, right, Bukele's government, more than 4 million Salvadorans right now own have downloaded Chivo wallet, right? So they have some sort of access to the formal financial system, right? And so I think that the powerful side of that approach is that El Salvador achieved in a matter of months what South America's biggest cryptocurrency exchange hasn't achieved in over 9 years. Like Mercado Bitcoin, right? So Brazil's biggest exchange and Latin America's biggest exchange has roughly over 3 million users, and they launched it back in 2013, right? So right. So I think that it is an interesting approach. This the one that El Salvador's government took, because they literally banked over 4 million people again in just like what 2 months, and the biggest the biggest private cryptocurrency company of the continent wasn't able to do that, right? So if you ask me, it's an interesting way, and it's just the initial stage. It's just that it's initial stages, right? Like, of course, this, like, we could dive into what we already discussed, that this part of the world has volatile economies, volatile governments can be thrown out or whatever, but it's more of like a pure political discussion, right? So I guess that it has positive things, just like anything. It has trade-offs, uh, but it was amazing, man. Honestly, it was amazing seeing this swath of Bitcoiners traveling globally in the midst of pandemic times or crisis times, or whatever the term you want to use. Everybody flew there just to see what was happening, contribute to the economy, have Bitcoin discussions. How can we further help El Salvador? What is actually happening in El Salvador? I paid for some pupusas on the street, like $1 of pupusas using Bitcoin. You know what I mean? Like this two teenagers that sell pupusas and coffee on the streets to make a living, they now have access to Bitcoin, and they have their $30 in Bitcoin that was deposited to them by the Salvadoran government. So if you ask me as a Venezuelan, I would have loved a long time ago seeing my government, right, do a similar approach, right, which is the complete opposite, right? Like they tried creating their own. Like, look, Venezuela's central bank is trying to look into ways to custody by themselves Bitcoin and Ethereum to make international payments through the central bank. They even at some point evaluated, like issuing a Petro on the Ethereum blockchain, the Dash blockchain, or whichever blockchain, or whatever. You know what I mean? Like, and they came back to the same conclusion, that was, we can only do this at some point with Bitcoin, with like RGB smart contracts or whatever, you know what I mean? Like, but if we do that, we're just gonna be losing some of our power, and we're gonna be giving that back to the people, and we're gonna be doing free marketing for Bitcoin, and that's a pretty much at least a more democratic approach to it than issuing your own sovereign cryptocurrency that nobody knows where it lives in, and that is backed by your national reserves that you pretty much control by yourself, whatever. So if you ask me, I feel invigorated, and I felt this vibrant passion when I went to El Salvador, just to meet other Bitcoiners coming from all over the world, just to do whatever it is that we love doing, man. So I think it's a net positive approach, the El Salvador's approach so far. Go ahead, Mauricio. I think you could expand on this very well.
Yeah, thank you, Elliot. No, I think so. First off, I want to say kudos to the Lightning Labs guys. I came back from El Salvador, an absolute Lightning believer. It was crazy to see it in the wild, and it's just amazing to see how the fees are basically zero. So I came back very much a Lightning believer. I didn't have a chance to be interact too much with Lightning before the trip, but when I saw how people were using it, it really changed my view. What I will say, as Venezuelans, we're very jaded by politics. And we've seen politics essentially look great one day, and 6 months later, the entire country hates you, and you can't be voted out. And so that all can change very quickly in terms of politics. I think it was a very interesting move from their part. One thing to consider is El Salvador did not give up seigniorage rights by adding Bitcoin. They never had seigniorage rights to begin with because they were dollarized. So it's easier in some ways for El Salvador to adopt Bitcoin than it is for someone that has their own local currency. Because by doing that, El Salvador isn't making their own currency look like crap. It's making the dollar potentially look like crap. As its value inflates away against Bitcoin. So in that sense, I think it's very forward looking. It looks like a genuine attempt to help the people of El Salvador, because as a government, you're introducing a currency that you cannot control or manipulate. So I thought that was pretty interesting. The only thing that I worry about, or one of the things that I worry about, is one is this idea of Bitcoin becoming politicized. So I don't think we should have politicians lead Bitcoin, because when that happens, you'll have one political party that is very pro Bitcoin. The other one will take the natural opposing view, which is anti-Bitcoin. And I think that as the democracy kind of ebbs and flows between the two, that could hurt Bitcoin in the long term. I would love to see a fully bipartisan support for Bitcoin in any sort of house of government, because that ensures that there's not going to be this passing of the baton between the pro Bitcoin and the non-pro Bitcoin groups. So that concerns me a bit, that maybe we could potentially pigeonhole Bitcoin into one side of the political group and essentially not get the full benefit of having a bipartisan support on the two. And the other one, which is, Matt, going back to this sanctions world, the El Salvador bond is a very interesting development in the sense that it will be, if it's successful, or when it's successful, I do believe it will be successful. It will be the first time that a sovereign country has raised sovereign debt, outside of the rails of the traditional finance world, i.e., the IMF, i.e., the US controlled bond markets. I think that right now it sounds a bit benign when we see El Salvador raising these bonds and blah, 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 and we all like their sort of project that they're behind. But what quickly will follow is every other rogue state that has been blocked out of these financial markets is going to try to do the same. And so, going back to the point we had earlier around sanctions, I think there's a lot of unintended consequences that some of this could have, that are, it warrants a conversation.
That's interesting. I appreciate both your insights. I made a similar conclusion on it's interesting that, it makes a lot of sense to me that, one of the first country that adopted Bitcoin as legal tender was already a dollarized country, so they didn't give up their seigniorage rights, that just makes sense to me. The Chivo wallet concerns me. Reliance on the Chivo wallet concerns me. In a lot of ways, that seems, very similar to like the CBDC strategy, or if you're going to be extreme, like the Petro strategy. But obviously, it's using dollars and Bitcoin instead of some made up shitcoin. But there's some concern there. The bipartisan comment is interesting because, do you not agree that that aspect might not even matter, because by the time opposition gets power, if the people are already accustomed to Bitcoin and using Bitcoin, it might just be completely unpalatable for anyone to kind of pull back on that decision. Like, I feel like it's really sticky once they have access, especially, it's not just Bitcoin, right? Once they have access to Bitcoin and the broader ecosystem, they're able to use stable coins and whatnot.
No, but
it's pretty hard to put that cat back in the bag, no?
Yeah, but the fear is always the charlatan politicians that'll turn the speech around and say that Bitcoin is the cause of your hyperinflation. Right. Bitcoin is the reason that you're being left behind. And with their program to get you free stuff, you won't have to think about Bitcoin anymore, because you have to work to get the Bitcoin. Whereas with their program, you'll get everything for free.
Right. Free stuff.
People vote for free stuff, believe me.
Yeah, I feel that. Awesome. Well, I think this discussion was absolutely fantastic. I hope the freaks agree with me. We're past the 2-hour point. I respect and appreciate both of your time coming on here and sharing with us. Before we wrap this up, you guys, I like to finish this with some final thoughts. So, Sultan, final thoughts.
His final thoughts is that listening into our Venezuelan story, you need to understand that fiat is a hard bitch to kill. It's not gonna go away anytime soon. So you better keep stacking sats, because you're doing the right thing by doing it. And ultimately, just be wary out there. Honestly, nobody's coming to save you. And I do feel that we still haven't felt the true need as a global community to get into we have to build until we die like vibe. But I think that at some point, with more government pressure and etc., that could become a thing. So keep building out there, whatever it is that you're building on top of Bitcoin, and understand that education is still needed. And yeah, not only in the US, it's it's a global thing, and we need to continue like on tapping, right? Like I'm sorry, tapping into those. There are some voices out there that need to be heard, and we're not hearing them right now. And we got to continue doing a better job of doing that. So I'm thankful for approaches like the Citadel Dispatch that help at doing that, man. And I say that from from the bottom of my heart as a Venezuelan, that for many years I just wanted to have voice, and what gave me voice is Bitcoin. And thank you all.
Cheers. Appreciate you. Mauricio, final thoughts.
Ah, man, final thoughts. Uh, I think it's easy to think about all the stuff that is kind of falling apart around the world. But what I do love about Bitcoin is that it feels like it's the complete opposite. It feels like we're actually rebuilding the entire system from the ground up in a way that we we want to see into the future. So I just think being in this industry has shifted my perspective into the world is ending to we're rebuilding the world into a better place. And so I just want to thank you all for making Bitcoin what it is today. And 4 years ago, 3 years ago, I was listening to these podcasts just the same way many people are, and Bitcoin is so new and is so filled with opportunity that I think the best way to make sure that it goes in the direction that we want is to be involved and stay involved, and to always have a say. I think one of the biggest problems with politics is we've all become so disenfranchised with politics. We feel like it's not good enough for us to deal with. Someone else has to deal with it, and when that happens, you get that someone else in power, and that is much always way worse than if you had stayed and try to express your view. So I would encourage everybody to get involved in Bitcoin and continue defending their beliefs so that we can play your role in keeping Bitcoin in the direction we all want it to be.
Thanks, Mauricio. Very well said. So I just wanted to thank our guests. Thank you for your time. Thank you for all your work. It is appreciated. I wanted to thank the freaks for joining in for another Citadel Dispatch. Dispatch is meant to model the open source projects that we so much rely on today, and we will rely on going forward if we want this movement to be successful. And with that, it means I'm relying on you freaks to support the show, to provide feedback, to participate. All those links are available at citadeldispatch.com. Don't hesitate to reach out. Join the chat. The link is there. Subscribe to the podcast. All the archives are there. There's links to support the show using Bitcoin. At the end of the day, it's all about you guys. I think together we can truly make this world a better place. Hopefully put some of these stories behind us rather than relive them over and over again in the future. Thanks for joining us, guys. I really do appreciate you.
No, likewise.
Thanks for having
man.
us, Matt.
Thank you for the opportunity, dude.
Cheers. Until next time, I look forward to meeting you guys in person someday.
Farewell, my friend.
Cheers. Rest in peace, Meatloaf. Love your freaks. See you next week. Stay humble, stack sats.